Good morning again. My name is Steve Sell. I'm from the Reading and Writing Project, which is based at Teachers College in Columbia University, and that's located in New York City. I work with schools and teachers across the globe. We focus on literacy in primary and secondary school. We focus on running reading and writing workshop classrooms. I taught middle school for 12 years in New York City. A couple of years ago, my family left New York City and we moved out to the country. This was a big move for me. I grew up in cities. I was born in a city in the United States called Chicago. I also had the privilege of growing up overseas. I lived in Hong Kong and in Japan, in Tokyo. So I'm a big city person. I was very used to being in a city. And the first thing I wanted to do when I left the city, and I think it's what everybody thinks about doing the first time you leave the city, is I wanted to get some chickens. My wife agreed we should get some chickens. And this is a big thing now in the US. Like people, if they have some space, they want to get a few chickens. You have fresh eggs every day. So I was really excited about this. There was a problem though. I needed to build a house for them. And while my father was an engineer, and growing up he taught me how to make a lot of things, how to take things apart, because I grew up in a city, I never really had the space to build something on my own. So this was a huge problem. Having the chickens was easy. They're cheap. They cost like $1 a chick. You get them, you raise them, it's no problem. Honestly, if they die, it's not that big of a deal. There's always more chicks that you can get. So I wasn't worried about raising the chicks. And I knew that it would be great for my daughter. We'd have a pet, or she'd have multiple pets. So we went ahead. We bought a few chicks. We ordered them, actually, which is a little strange to order chickens. We ordered the chicks, and we waited for them to come. But the big problem was I needed to figure out how to build this house. So I decided to talk with people. And I didn't know anything about this. So I went right to the expert, my neighbor. He has lots of animals. So I went right to him, and I asked him for some advice. And he gave me some great advice about things to make sure I do to protect them. He even shared with me some ideas around like how I could build the house. And it was really helpful. But he was an expert, so I feel like in some ways I couldn't relate to everything he was saying, but he definitely helped. So then I decided to go to a friend down the street who also had some chickens. And he was more like me. You know, he had never really built anything before, so he was really willing to share what that experience was like. And he told me all the things that went into building the house and how he really made a lot of mistakes. And that made me feel a lot better because I felt like I might be the kind of person that when I started building it would maybe make some mistakes. So it was really helpful to talk to him. And then I decided to talk to a friend who doesn't own chickens at all. Like he had never owned them. He doesn't have any interest in them. He actually thinks it's a really bad idea that I'm doing it. He thought it was kind of dumb. So I went to Scott and I said, you know what, Scott, I know you've built different structures before, like houses, and I know you know a lot about making a roof. So I asked him about that, and he gave me some great feedback. So this whole experience had me thinking about, in my classrooms, with the teachers that I work with and the students that I work with, the value of talk, even when kids don't really know yet what it is, as far as the content that they're trying to grasp or the skill work that they're struggling with, that the value of talk is that when you can talk with an expert every day, or maybe somebody who's more at your level, or maybe even talking with a partner who really is in a completely different world as far as their interests go, that value of talk can really help support students in emerging with new material. So to start out today, I want you to turn to your partner and share a time from your life when talking with another person really helped you learn something new. It could be material, new material that you were learning, content, or maybe even just an idea that you were struggling with in your life. So turn to the person next to you and share a time from your life that you can think you remember really learning from that person. Okay, so let's come back together. So I'm sure it's no surprise to any of us that when we're able to talk with someone, whether that person's an expert in that area, whether that person has no connection to what we're trying to learn about, that can really help us process. And when I'm thinking about this in our classrooms, I think a nice way to visualize this is that we want our kids to be floating on a sea of talk as they learn. Our classrooms should be filled with conversations, not waiting for when we feel like they have the understanding or capacity to engage in discourse, but having it as a part of the process throughout. And there's a lot of research supporting this, that in fact, kids need check-ins every 7 minutes just to stay engaged. And there's lots of ways that you can do that, and one of those ways is turn and talk. And in reading and writing workshop classrooms, the turn and talk is sort of, in my opinion, the heartbeat of the work that the teacher and the students are doing. So I want to think through a little bit about why partner talk matters, and then we're going to practice this with a read aloud today. So when we're thinking about partner talk, one of the things that really comes up with me in my experience in the classroom and now my experience as a consultant working with schools is that what I see in the value of partner talk is I hear kids grappling with new ideas and with new concepts. And that experience as a writer and as a reader is really going to lead you to new thinking. And most importantly, to growth. The growth mindset, this idea is a huge idea in schools across the globe. And I believe that partner talk is one method for teachers to be able to assess growth and for students to be able to grow. And another thing that I think is important is this idea that we need to value social opportunities in the classroom. Our kids, if the academic culture does not value peer relationships and social opportunity, Pedro Noguero at NYU has done a lot of research on this. He says that kids will gravitate towards the social and away from the academic. So our academic settings, our schools, need to honor the fact that kids need opportunities to talk with each other in structured ways. There's lots of ways that we can do partner talk. Today I mentioned we're going to practice this in a read aloud. If you use mini lessons as a model for delivering instruction in your classroom, and a mini lesson is something you can use across the content areas in math, in reading and writing, that is a great opportunity to assess and check in on whether students are understanding the new skill or strategy. Partnerships are great for setting goals and having kids check in. And I think one of my favorite areas in terms of partnership work is within writing. When I teach students in writing workshop, I have to think so deeply about the kinds of partnerships I create. Because those partnerships will help students grow. And I'm focusing on writing because I think writing is one of those areas, while the work of the student is a bit more visible, it's on the page, we can see and assess what the student's able to do by reading a draft or opening up a notebook. I think the way to get students to take what's interior and make that work exterior is to have them talk first, before they're even going down onto the page. And that's one of the real connections I've seen with partner talk in writing, that we need to give our kids more opportunities to rehearse aloud, to talk through what it is they want to write before they get things on the page. Because even some of our strongest, most engaged writers, once they get it down on the page, they're less willing to change. And I think that's true of us as adults too. Once you start to put something down in your computer or in your notebook, it feels like it's going to stay there. It's not going to change that much. And all writers know that revision is really the most important part of the writing process. And we can put a lot of value in teaching revision in terms of how much time we give, but if we don't give our students opportunities before they get that work down on the page to talk, not just with the same person every day, but with multiple people, they're less likely to engage in the work that they need to be doing in writing, which is to grow. So with partnerships, one of the things that I feel is the most contentious issue in schools is how to create partnerships. And in many schools, in the schools that I've taught in, the schools that I work with, I see partnerships arranged by ability. So that means perhaps maybe in a reading workshop classroom or in a English language arts classroom, you're arranging your partnerships according to what you know about their reading levels. Or maybe you're looking at data such as test scores, and the teacher uses that to set up partnerships. So that's what I think of when I think of ability partnerships. And just thinking back to that story I told you at the beginning, the second friend I went to, he was more at my level. That second friend who sort of had the same knowledge about building things, he would be my ability partner. And those sorts of partnerships are great. But what's problematic is when we keep kids in that type of partnership the entire school year, or for their entire academic life. They're only working with someone who's exactly the same, has the same test score, has the same reading level, has the same grade. It's a slippery slope. Interest partnerships. So when you're thinking about that, in reading, another great example of this would be students who are interested in the same genres. There's, I think in young adult fiction, there's been this explosion with dystopian novels. So there's many students who love to share the new novel they're reading or the new series they're reading, or perhaps they love to read historical fiction, and they have lots to share about that. And then we have the social partnerships. So these are the kinds of partnerships where you're really honoring social opportunity in class. So your social interest partnerships, it doesn't mean you're putting best friends together all the time. It might mean what you're doing is you're putting people together who you know have a mutual admiration for each other. Maybe the student who has a lower ability in your class, whatever that might mean, maybe it's the reading level, and they know that there's another student in the class that they see as sort of a mentor, a possible mentor. And that can be a way of tapping into the work that they can do peer-to-peer that we can't always do as a teacher. From year to year, you know who your students are that the rest of the class really looks up to and knows that there's something that they can learn from. And so when we make partnerships, one thing to consider is matching those kids together. You can also put friends together. And sometimes teachers are afraid to do that. They think that they'll be excessively chatty, they won't be on topic. But giving kids that opportunity to work with someone who they have a strong relationship in and out of school can really push them towards new growth and new thinking. The same thing applies with the ability partnerships. If you keep them together in that social partnership all year, that may not lead to the growth you want. But the point here is when you're mixing your partnerships, you want to think about cycling through these few types of partnerships within a given school year. And oftentimes what has worked for me is going unit by unit and changing my partnerships and thinking, have I had mainly partnerships based on ability in this unit? And if the answer is yes, I might want to switch it up and think more about interest than ability in the next unit. Or if you're a teacher that teaches reading and writing, if you're an English teacher, you might have reading partnerships and writing partnerships because ability will change from one area to the next. So we're going to try this out, Partner Talk, in a read aloud. And we're going to use a protocol that we're using quite a bit across the curriculum now, and we call it an argument protocol or a debate protocol. So we're not going to be having an actual debate here, but we're going to be using this protocol to do some turning and talking with a partner. And this is somewhat of a new bit of work that we're doing at the Reading and Writing Project. In the last 5 years, we've done a lot of research around argumentation. And we've come to develop this protocol which allows students to bring what they're thinking and rehearse it through talk first before getting anything down in writing. And we found that in this protocol, Students are really enabled to practice some of the close reading work that we want them to be doing in literature, that when we use informational texts, they're able to pick through and identify text-based analysis, and of course, they're able to rehearse their ideas. So this protocol starts with the teacher setting up an argument or posing a question, and I'm about to do that in just a minute. From there, I'm going to read aloud a text. I'm going to give you opportunities in the text to turn and talk. Now the key here is that, and this is the debate part, you're each going to have a different position, you and your partner. And I'll let you know what positions you're going to have or what options you have for your positions in just a minute. During the read aloud, as you're turning and talking, you're each going to get a chance to share, using evidence from the text, anything you think that can support your position. So we're going to try this out. We're going to use a text called Fly Away Home by Eve Bunting. Wonderful story. We're going to read this 2 times. The first time we're going to read it without words. So I'm just going to go through the book, and I have all the pictures up here without words the first time. Here's our debate. This story takes place in an airport, and that's really all you need to know before we get going. That's all you need to know. Well, one more thing. There's a father and his child living in an airport. So, one partner is going to argue that the airport is a good place to live. And another partner is going to argue that the airport is a bad place to live. So before I get going, I want you to turn to your partners and decide who is going to argue that it's a good place to live and who's going to argue that it's a bad place to live, based on textual evidence, not on whether you think you'd want to live in an airport, obviously. Okay, so as I mentioned the first time through, we're just going to be reading the pictures. I am going to cue you for some turn and talks as we're just reading the pictures the first time through. Okay, Fly Away Home. I want you to turn and talk. The partner that's arguing that it's a good place to live, I want you to go first. And then the partner that's arguing it's a bad place to live, you're going to go second. Right? You're each going to have just 1 minute. So turn and talk. Okay, so switch, make sure the other partner gets to talk as well. Okay, partners, so let's come back together, and we're going to continue with Fly Away Home. I want you to turn and talk. So this time, let's have the other partner go first. So turn and talk. Good place to live or a bad place to live? Yes. So switch. All right, let's come back together, partners. And we're going to continue with Fly Away Home. All right, let's turn to talk. So again, switch who's going to go first this time. So turn and talk with your partner. Good place to live or a bad place to live? Okay, so switch. Okay, so let's come back together, partners. So before we continue, it's really interesting to see, even though I didn't ask you to do this, that some of you are taking some notes, you're jotting down some evidence, preparing, knowing that you're going to have to turn and talk. So it's really nice to see some of you doing that. You don't have to do that, but that might help you so that you have some evidence that you can bring to that turn and talk. All right, so let's continue reading. Okay, so that's the end of Fly Away Home. Before you turn and talk, this is going to be your last turn and talk. I want you to take a minute and think of the two best reasons that you could think of from the text to support your side. So the two best reasons that you can think of. And some of you that took notes, you may be able to just go through and quickly rank them, put a star next to the two, or you might just want to think back, like what were two images, or even just two things you've said already that could best prove your side. And I'll give you a minute to do that before I ask you to turn and talk. Okay, so if you think it's a good place to live, if that was your position, you're going to go first, and make sure you're keeping it with evidence from the text, focused on the best reasons that you chose to support your answer. So you're each going to have about a minute. Let's turn and talk and have, if you think it's a good place to live, let's have you go first. Turn and talk. Okay, so switch. So make sure that now you're switching to those that think it's a bad place to live. Okay, so let's come back together. So as I mentioned, we're gonna go through the text again, where I'm gonna read it aloud with the words, and you'll have the pictures too. But before we do that, I just want to name what I did. I had you as readers think about setting. And that is something we consider to be a skill that's important for all of our readers to be able to master in order to go and think about things like author's craft or identifying themes in a text. So you can see how doing something like this without the words is a great way to get kids practicing thinking about setting. So even if they're maybe struggling as readers, just having the images can work, or just making sure you set up opportunities for them to identify setting in a read aloud and practice doing that with a partner. And imagine if you have partners together where one of them is able to do that without any problem. They can do that in every text they read at their level. And maybe you have another partner who's really struggling, and you have them sharing this experience through a common text, and you have that partner that's maybe struggling, learning from the other partner. So I'm giving a lot of examples of how this might look in an English classroom. Before we go on to the next read aloud, where we're going to raise the level of the reading work we're going to do, what I want you to do is just think about imagining some of the skill work that your students are struggling with that you think is essential to the content you're teaching. And I want you just to sort of name out with your partner right now in the subjects that you teach or in the areas that you support teachers, if you're not in the classroom, what are some of the essential skills, those building block skills that you think your kids really need more opportunities to talk with a partner to help grow? So turn and talk with your partner and just sort of imagine what some of those skills might be, those foundational skills. Yeah, like the skill areas. I mean, if you're an English teacher, I mentioned setting. So setting, character, so any of the sort of foundational skills. Okay, so let's come back together. Our next debate here, when we're reading the text this time, is to think about whether the pictures or the words are more powerful in showing the kind of place the airport is. Whether the picture or the words. So what that means is one person is going to have to argue the pictures are more powerful, and one person's going to have to argue that it's the words that are more powerful. So this is really having you think about author's craft here. We looked at setting, now we're raising the level and thinking about the craft here. The pictures versus the words. So decide who's going to focus on pictures, decide who's going to focus on the words as we read through. So when you set up a debate like this, you may want to think about if this is like a new skill for your students, if you're getting into craft work with your kids and having them think about author's craft, maybe you're even trying to get them to transfer that into their writing. You would definitely want to be doing lots of assessing while you're listening to this talk. Because you're not going to be able, unless you're recording it, you're not going to be able to have a record of it. It's not like you're asking them to write everything down. Notice I didn't give you instructions to keep Post-its or to be stopping and jotting or writing in a notebook. So that invisible nature of talk is what can somewhat make this complicated for teachers. So it's important when the partner talk's happening that we're involved in it in terms of circulating around our room and making sure that we're listening in, especially when we know we need to assess how they're doing with this. So I'm going to be listening. My dad and I live in an airport. That's because we don't have a home, and the airport is better than the streets. We are careful not to get caught. Mr. Slocum and Mr. Vale were caught last night. 10 green bottles hanging on the wall, they sang. They were as loud as 2 moose bellowing. Dad says they broke the first rule of living here. Don't get noticed. Dad and I try not to get noticed. We stay among the crowds. We change airlines. Delta, TWA, Northwest. We love them all, Dad says. He and I wear blue jeans and blue t-shirts and black jackets. We each have a blue zippered bag with a change of blue clothes. Not to be noticed is to look like nobody at all. All right, I want you to turn and talk. Is it the pictures or the words now that you're thinking are more powerful in describing the kind of place this airport is? So turn and talk. Let's have, if you think pictures, let's have you go first. Okay, so switch. If you think it's the words, I want you to turn and talk. It's different now. Yeah, yeah. Yes. All right, so let's come back together. Quite a different experience now getting the words. Once we saw a woman pushing a metal cart full of stuff. She wore a long, dirty coat, and she lay down across a row of seats in front of Continental Gate 6. The cart, the dirty coat, the lying down were all noticeable. Security moved her out real fast. So I'm going to have you turn and talk about what we just did, reading through the pictures first and the words, but I just want to talk about and share out a couple of things first that are important to think about with partner talk. So one is that you could have students in this sort of situation keeping notes. As I mentioned, some of you were doing that naturally, and that might be a system that you want to think about. If you have that in your classroom, for students to be jotting things down as you're reading, collecting evidence. You could also have the students with a copy of the story. If you do annotation work in your classroom, when you're reading aloud, it can be really helpful to have the kids with a copy of the text so they can annotate, prepare for their turn and talk. That's also great for just making some of this work a bit more visible for you so that you can actually go around and not just listen in, but also see some of the work that they're doing. The thing we want to make sure, if we are having kids write down, whether it's annotations, whether it's some quick jots in the notebook, the thing we want to make sure that we encourage students to avoid doing is to just read off of a script when they turn and talk. The whole goal of the turn and talk is that they're having authentic conversations. They're talking through the work that we're trying to do. In this case, we were thinking about craft and about setting. They're working through some of the difficulty that they might be having formulating their ideas. So while the notes might be helpful or the annotations might be helpful, we don't want them to get stuck to that as a script. So I want you to turn and talk. There's a couple of questions that you could think through. I know many of you were really moved the second time we read the story. It really sort of shifted your whole thinking about the text. So you may want to talk about that second question, thinking through how the conversations with your partner were a bit different the second time around. So turn and talk and just use those two questions as a way to discuss the two activities that we just did with the read aloud.
هنكمل فيها.
Okay, let's come back together. So, at the start, I sort of went through some different ways in which you might organize partnerships, and obviously today you just sat next to someone that maybe you've never met before. And what's great about that is that you all bring something different. Everything from where you teach, what you teach, and also how you go about the art of reading. And I do believe that reading is an art, just like writing. So when you're looking at this text, you all bring a little bit something different. And that, I think, enriches your conversations. And many of you, as you were debriefing, shared that the experience of hearing someone who has a totally different background with this work really helped you see things differently or in a new way. Also, what was really fascinating is that many of you have read this story before. And that's why I showed you the pictures first. Because those of you that have read the story, you have to detach yourself from the text. Because as you could see when we looked at it the second time through and we were looking at the words, the story comes to life a little bit more. The place comes to life a little bit more. The characters, we know more about them through the words. But having to look at the pictures first really sort of changes your thinking if you've already read this text. And if you haven't, I think the experience of looking at the pictures first and then the words is really powerful. So the first time through, what you were able to do that imagine some of your students that maybe would not be possible for them if they had the text in front of them, what you were able to do was focus on setting by looking at just the pictures. If I just gave you the text and you had just the text in front of you and no pictures, you would notice right away that you would have to do a lot of inferring to pick up on the kind of place this airport is. And inference is something that students struggle with. It's a skill that they've not mastered in many of our classes. It's something that even as they move up grade levels and encounter more difficult texts, that they're going to continue to struggle with. And inference is powerful to not just identifying things like setting, but also making connections to theme and symbols and other literary devices. So that ability to detach from the text in that way and not have the words there but the pictures helps you practice the skill of talking about setting. It doesn't mean that every single student in your room is reading a book like this with pictures. But what it means is you can let them know at the end, hey, what we just did is we practiced reading and paying attention to setting. That's something you're going to need to do anytime you read. It's going to be a little bit harder than maybe it was today, but you were just able to have great conversations about setting. And what you might want to do is share out a couple of thoughts or ideas that you heard some of the partnerships discuss about the setting. And then the practice the second time through is that I was able to have you push your thinking to a whole other level, thinking about author's craft, which is high-level thinking work that we want all of our kids to be able to do. And many of you noticed that the story is much more moving in many ways, at least in my opinion, maybe some of you disagree, when you have the words and the pictures. You learn so much more about the characters. And we all know that most of us read for character. We don't pick up a book and think, I can't wait to read about the setting in this story. All I'm going to care about is where the story takes place. I don't care about the characters. No, we want to know about the characters. That's one of the reasons we pick up literature. Right? We sometimes want to read about people like us, or we want to read about people that are not like us at all. So when we read, and many of our kids too, they go right to character. That's what they focus on. So that's another example of why this can be really powerful to do in talk. You get kids to not focus on the skills that they normally sort of think of as their strengths, and that is paying attention to character. So I want to just talk through, before we wrap up for today, a few potential challenges that can come up when you're having turn and talks happen. So imagine if I had you going into some writing right now, like maybe let's say I wanted you to do a notebook entry, or maybe even turn this into some more literary analysis, like a literary essay. What you might notice happen is that some of the students who were engaged in high-level talk in their partnerships start to do some writing work that's low level. They're not using the same evidence that they just talked about. They're not articulating themselves in the same way. So that's a potential challenge that you're going to see sometimes when you have them go from talk into writing. Don't be defeated by that. When you see that happen, just know that that will possibly happen. A couple of ways that you can support that is to make sure that you have sentence starters for kids. Have some prompts up so the kids can see ways that they can now put their thoughts onto the page. Something as simple as, especially for a struggling student, I think. Just putting that little prompt right there can help them get that first idea down. Or I notice can help them get that first idea down. So those prompts, any of those scaffolds that you use for kids with their writing are going to be important, because you might be excited about the talk, but know that it's not always going to transfer immediately to the page. And the other thing is that in your conversations in your classroom in the turn and talks, you might hear kids talking a little bit more casually, not using the academic language or literary language that you're using or reinforcing in the class. So again, that's where you, as you're circulating, can give immediate feedback. If you hear kids using words or struggling to find the words to describe something, you want to make sure you're pushing them towards using more academic or literary language. And that's going to be one of those, again, powerful, immediate pieces of feedback that you can give students right in the moment. And just know that you're, just like anything, going to have to do that repeatedly so that they can be practicing this as they talk. So that might mean, in this case today, kids might not be mentioning the word setting as they're describing the place. They might just be saying the airport, that place. If you want them to be understanding that we're focused on setting, then you can just quickly coach in and just keep saying that word. Setting, 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 setting. That's literary language. So that's one example of a way that you can support kids in the challenges that they're going to have after partner talk. You can also do that when they go into writing and give them immediate feedback. If you notice that they're struggling as a writer, the feedback could be, there's a chart in the room, I want you to take a look at this chart. It has some prompts that might help you with getting some of your thoughts down on the page. Just one second. Also, you can think about, sometimes if you have partner talk, especially if the case is that it's not academic enough, that's where you might want to change your partnerships. If you hear as kids are talking that they're not focused on the academic language or they're just being too social, that's where you're going to know, hey, I need to change this partnership up. The next time we do a read aloud, those two people are not going to work well together. A big thing I think to have up in your room is a word wall, if you don't have that, or charts that give students academic vocabulary. So one thing that I've seen a lot of teachers do is to put up words that are common words that students use to describe the reading that they're doing. So a quick example would be sad. That's a word that sometimes kids use very frequently, sad. So what you can do on a word wall is underneath the word sad, you can list a bunch of synonyms for sad. And that will give them a place to go to. So if you hear kids using a low-level word like sad, you can say, what's another way to say that? Let's look at the word wall. You could do the same thing with any of those words that you hear students using repeatedly. So I want you to just turn and talk and think through this idea that I put out at the start of the day, that we want to make sure that what's happening in our classroom is that our students are floating on a sea of talk. And just imagine in your classroom what that might look like, how you might be able to set that up with your students. what structures you might want to have in place, or even considering whether you have a read aloud that you could start out trying this with your students the next time you're in your class. So just turn and talk with your partner about that.